and we help companies comply with that. So today we're talking about general product safety regulation. I think it's fair to say it has hit our businesses in the UK as a whole, Great Britain and Northern Ireland kind of left field. And I think it's fair to say that there is still some learning happening, within the EU itself in terms of businesses having to get their heads around what they need to do to comply. So I'm just going to run through, why won't my slides move? Let's see if this works. Forgive me, I haven't used Google Meet before, so this is new to me, and I probably should have flicked through them before. There we go, that'll work. So in terms of a brief agenda, I'm just going to start off by explaining the existing product safety landscape within the EU, because then you kind of see where GPSR fits, and then we'll talk about how it sits alongside CE marked goods. So some of you may have goods that are already conforming to what we call harmonized standards within the EU, and as such you can self-certify to apply the CE mark, which is kind of like a kite mark and globally recognized as being the badge of showing that you comply with very, very stringent regulation from the EU. And we'll talk about what's in scope with of GPSR, and sometimes it's easier to say what's not in scope rather than what is in scope, because it's kind of a catch-all regulation. Then I'll draw your attention to some notable points within the regulation itself. Just sometimes when you're faced with kind of rafts and rafts of EU regulatory speak, it can be difficult to understand which bits to tease out and what they actually mean in reality to your business. And then we'll talk about what the EU refers to as safety standards. So there is no harmonized standard for safety compliance within GPSR. Rather we have this set of kind of guidelines. So we'll cover those off so that when you're doing your risk assessments and you're pulling together the essential safety information that now needs to accompany your product when shipping to consumers in the EU, then you'll understand how to go about those safety assessments. The regulation rather helpfully breaks down, as does much EU regulation, breaks down the obligations on different businesses depending on where they sit within a product supply chain. So we'll talk about that. Essentially, the regulation splits it by manufacturers, distributors, importers. Quite often, distributors and importers are one and the same. And then also by authorized representatives. And then there is a specific role that online marketplaces like Amazon, Etsy, eBay, and so on have to perform in terms of regulating their sellers, essentially. And then we'll talk about kind of where the regulation may move from today. It's very, very early days. It only came into force on the 13th of December. And we'll talk about, the Safety Gate portal, which is the mechanism for kind of communicating with the market surveillance authorities across the EU, and why it's important that as a manufacturer or a player in the supply chain that you must register a profile on there and look for product safety updates. And then I'll talk about kind of what Global Trade Department in collaboration with the Department for Business and Trade and Business Wales, which you'll see on these slides, are doing to try and increase the regulatory awareness, especially amongst our SMEs and our micro businesses, because we can't have these situations where GPSR kind of, just appears. We've been talking to our clients about GPSR since it came into force in May not last year, but the year before. But DBT has kind of given us this voice, and Business Wales have given us this voice, so we can get the word out more broadly. And obviously, as today, we've been invited to present to a number of different federations and associations where they feel like they've been in the dark as well. So we're just trying to increase our awareness, because when we have time, when we know what's coming down the line and we know what impact it has on our business, we can take our time to prepare, and that prevents us from making kind of knee-jerk, expensive decisions and, making compliance far more costly than it ought to be. So that's kind of like a rough agenda. How did I move these slides on again? See if I can do it. Was it that? There we go. So the existing product safety landscape in the EU at the moment, where I've listed vertical regulation, That is all of that lovely regulation and legislation that you must adhere to have your product CE marked. So it's quite often that a company will have to comply with more than one for a product. So sometimes the example I use is that you know, you might have outdoor machinery that might need to comply with the machinery directive, but also noise emission in the environment directive as well. So you can imagine the technical files that are compiled for some of these CE marked goods can be really quite thick dossiers, really, when a product's been on the market for some time. So that's your CE mark regulation. GPSR applies a layer of additional obligations on top of those products. I'll cover those off for you in a sec, but those CE marked goods are within the scope of GPSR. That's the important thing to remember. Out of scope of GPSR is this vertical regulation that I've put in brackets excluded. So that's like our medicinal products, our food and feed products, pesticides, antiques and works of art when they're over a certain age. These products already have quite stringent regulation to adhere to anyway, so they're out of the scope of GPSR. And then finally, there's regulation that GPSR actually repeals or withdraws or replaces from the market. And that is first and foremost the old General Product Safety Directive. So that's what has enabled all member states, including the UK, when we were part of the EU, we were able to develop our own Product Safety Act off the back of that General Product Safety Directive. Now, the challenge with the directive is within the sphere of EU regulation, is a directive allows member states to kind of play with the legislation a little bit and adapt it for their local market. And what happens is you get this kind of patchwork quilt effect. So if you're a company that's exporting to the EU, there will be quite a lot of legislation, not regulation, but legislation that is applied slightly differently depending on the member state that you're selling into. What GPSR aims to do is, because it's a regulation rather than a legislation, it aims to kind of consolidate all of that regulation at the Commission level. So all of the member states will have to comply quite rigidly, and it prevents that level of scope creep that we've seen over the last 20 years since the General Product Safety Directive was in place. It also repeals what we call the food imitating products regulation. So that's where products can look to be food but actually aren't, and that regulation wasn't deemed to be fit for purpose anymore either. So it's been kind of replaced by GPSR. So we've got a set of regulation that has additional obligations placed on it by GPSR, which is your vertical regulation for the CE mark. Then you've got regulation that it replaces, which is your general product safety and your food imitating product regulation. And then you've got sectors or regulation that's excluded. So that's kind of like the product safety landscape at the moment. Just touching on CE marked goods at the minute, because I don't know how many of you have got CE marked goods in place, but if your product carries the CE mark, then you'll have to have conformed to one or several of the 24 sets of regulation and legislation I referred to earlier. As I say, some products may need to comply with more than one. And you need to refer to, so within the regulation itself, you're directed to the certain standards by which you need to conform in order to say that you've complied with the regulation and affix your CE mark. But it's a global kite mark. It demonstrates to global markets that you have adhered or conformed to the most stringent set of regulations surrounding safety, health, and environmental protection. We just move on. When you're actually fixing the CE mark, there's two ways that you can actually go about it. So most companies will self-certify conformity with that regulation, but some products may warrant being sent off to a testing house or what we call a third party or a notified body, where they'll produce a pretty lengthy report sometimes based on the specific tests that they've undertaken. We've got the machinery directive, which has been in place for couple of decades now. That's going to be replaced in 2027, and that will impose more requirements on products to be tested by external bodies. So it's kind of starting to restrict the amount of products that companies can self-certify conformity on, but that's not till 2027, so let's not worry about that one today. Essentially, as the manufacturer, you're responsible for that conformity assessment procedure and drawing up the technical documentation or the technical file that stays with the goods, and kind of grows with the goods. Basically, as new standards are released and you test against those standards, then your technical dossier, your technical file kind of grows with you, and then you're responsible for placing the CE mark on your product, and there's very stringent guidelines as to how that needs to be formatted on your labeling and so on. And importantly, once you affix that CE mark, if you are a company that is not established in the EU, then you have to appoint a responsible person to represent your interests or be the conduit between you and the market surveillance authorities in the EU when you don't have that business or that individual entity. And I think it's fair to say that's kind of eclipsed certainly some businesses in Great Britain. There are a number of businesses that we're aware of that are selling CE marked goods into the EU, and they don't have a responsible person, and that's just kind of eclipsed them post Brexit. It just, you know, the communication hasn't gotten through, but it is a requirement. It is a regulatory requirement. That responsible person can be either what we call a natural person, which is an individual residing in the EU, or it can be a legal person, which is a company established in the EU. And when you similarly, that responsible person could potentially be an EU importer or a distributor, and they're responsible for keeping the manufacturer outside of the EU compliant with the regulations. So checking that the CE mark is in place, checking that the technical file is in place, that kind of thing. Now, I kind of see, and I'm not you know, I don't know whether it was intended to be this, but GPSR kind of feels a little bit like CE mark light. It imposes lots of the same obligations on companies that the CE mark does, but for a whole raft of different products. So it was essentially brought in, like I said, because the product safety directive, the old product safety directive, was not deemed to be fit for purpose anymore. So it doesn't account for the fact that we purchase things very differently now. You know, there's so much online sales, there's so many distance sales, like cross-border sales. You know, we're a truly global marketplace, and the old directive just didn't cater for that. It didn't cater for the fact that, you know, we've now got digital products that are available for download, and obviously those kind of products can pose cyber or malware risks and that kind of stuff. So the old directive, it didn't feel like there was sufficient protection for consumers in that regulation. Hence, this is a lot more robust in that way. It also recognises that there's more than one player in supply. So you can have a manufacturer. That manufacturer might have a manufacturer before them that's manufacturing for their brand, that and then there might be a distributor, an importer, reseller, stockist, and so on. There can be a lot of players in that supply chain and that distribution chain, and GPSR kind of makes it such that every player in that supply and distribution chain has a role to play to ensure that the product that's placed on the market is safe for consumers. So it's very much belts and braces, and it kind of sweeps up everything that falls beneath the cracks of the existing regulation. So where there's that vertical regulation and products don't fit within that, then GPSR kind of like sweeps it up. It also allows for better functioning of product safety recalls. So where a product has to be withdrawn from the market, the Commission is sets up very strict kind of instructions as to how that needs to be managed, even down to the fact that they will be issuing a standard recall template that everybody has to use if they're withdrawing product from the market. And like I said before, because it's regulation rather than legislation, it reduces that scope for member states to adapt you know, to their local legislation. So really longer term, it will make it easier for all of us that are sitting outside of the EU to actually comply with regulation, irrespective of which member state we are shipping our goods to. In terms of what's in scope, so as I mentioned, it's all CE marked goods fall within scope. And it also, interestingly, and it again kind of makes reference to the fact that we've got these new platforms now that, like eBay and so on, that allow us to extend the life of products. You know, we can resell products, we can refurbish products, we can see that products that might have been initially intended for professional or trade users can then be sold on to consumers. So it's kind of, again, it's that catch-all. It's kind of saying, you know, you might be selling professional or trade goods, but if there's the chance that those goods could fall into the hands of consumers by being sold on, then technically you have to comply with GPSR. Similarly, if you're repairing goods or reconditioning or recycling goods, then you have to consider the risk to the consumer and, you know, do your risk assessment and so on. You fall within the scope of GPSR. As I said, excluded are all those heavily regulated sectors anyway, living plants and food. You're talking about export health certificates, phytosanitary certificates. They've got their own bag to kind of like deal with. So they are exempt from GPSR, and services are exempt from GPSR. So if you're sat here and you're predominantly services, then it's happy days. Notable points within the regulation. So, you know, I talked before about the different roles that people play. So you've got kind of like manufacturer, you've got importer, distributor, and so on. They've got this catch-all phrase of economic operator, which sweeps up all of those other individual players within that supply chain that haven't been identified as manufacturer, distributor, importer, and so on. So it refers to economic operators. It imposes the requirement for that EU responsible person on products that previously wouldn't have required it. So as we've identified, if you've got CE marked goods on the EU marketplace and you're outside of the EU, then you should have had a responsible person in place anyway. But now with GPSR, even where those goods are non-CE marked, you now require a responsible person. Now, market surveillance regulation is very clear on what that responsible person can look like. It can be if the goods are originally manufactured in the EU, then that negates the requirement for, you know, you to appoint a responsible person. You can appoint your EU distributor or your EU importer as your responsible person, or you can appoint a specific kind of impartial or what's the word I'm looking for? Independent authorized representative, where that's basically what they do. They represent the interests of non-EU based businesses for regulatory purposes in the EU. What else did I want to say about that? I'll come back to that in a second. I referred to the safety gate portals. So these are platforms that the EU uses to notify market surveillance authorities for any dangerous goods or product safety issues. So similar to the UK and other countries around the world, they'll have different market surveillance authorities for different sectors. Like say in the UK, we've got Food Standards Agency, and then we've got DEFRA and all the rest of it. So in the case of product safety, the gateway is linked up to all of the relevant member states' market surveillance authorities. And should somebody within a product supply chain or distribution chain identify a product safety issue, they have to report it via the portal, and that triggers an alert to all of the market surveillance authorities so that that product can be withdrawn from the market expeditiously. The other requirement, or the other notable point within the regulation, is translation. And if we've got anybody on the call today that is based within the EU, this isn't such a culture shock, because you pick up a product off the shelf in the EU and you will see more than the local language on there. It's a shock to, particularly to Brits, where we think everybody speaks English. We now have to cater for that safety information on products to be in the official languages of the member states, of which there are 24. Just the product safety regulation, the product safety information, not necessarily the care information. So I appreciate that we're not talking to apparel manufacturers or textiles today, but the example I sometimes use is you might have a care label on an item of clothing that says, you know, iron on a low heat. If somebody then irons on a higher heat and burns the fabric, they impact the fabric's quality, or the item of clothing's quality, but not its safety. So you need to make a distinction between, you know, what's care or usage and what is actually safety, vital safety information. Where it's vital safety information, that must be in the local language of the market that you're shipping that product into. There's the notion of when a manufacturer is not a manufacturer. That could be where you are having a product manufactured elsewhere under your brand. The very fact that your brand is on that product by default makes you the manufacturer for the purposes of GPSR. Similarly, if you've bought a product and you've adapted it or processed it in such a way that you have fundamentally changed its risk profile and you need to conduct another risk assessment on it, then you're the manufacturer for the purposes of GPSR there as well. The challenge comes, and I don't know whether we'll ever see this, but the challenge comes in the fact that, you know, you remember me referring to the CE marked regulation. There are very stringent standards. It's very clear what we need to do, the tests that we must perform on our products. That doesn't exist with GPSR. So that's a little bit challenging. And I think it's meant to be that way because it's so vast in terms of the products that it sweeps up, that to establish a core standard would be virtually impossible. But I'll come on to those safety requirements that might make it a little bit clearer as to how we can go about conformity in a second. The regulation talks a lot about product safety communication. It talks about you know, how that communication must be clear amongst the different players in a supplier distribution chain. It has very clear remedies in the event of product safety recalls. And to be honest, many of you, most of you, if not all of you, are already doing this kind of thing. It's just asking us to kind of like document it and be very belts and braces about it. But for example, if you had a product safety issue with one of your products, you wouldn't ask your consumer to return it but expect them to pay the carriage to get it back to you. You know, you wouldn't ask them to dispose of it if it wasn't safe for them to dispose of it. So it's just really documenting a lot of the stuff that we as ethical manufacturers and, you know, companies that take product safety very seriously, we're already doing by and large. And then the regulation also includes penalties for non-compliance, which can be determined at the individual member state level. And I don't want to be alarmist about that. You know, when we talk about massive penalties, we're talking about real fraudulent events where you've deliberately withheld vital product information from the consumer that has subsequently placed that consumer at risk. That's real fraud. That's kind of custodial sentences. We're talking about, you know, maybe in the early stages, customs can't see that your goods are compliant, so they might hold the goods and tell you why they've held them. Or latterly, as they start to get a little bit more robust about it, as the regulation beds in, there'll be small fines, you know, 50, 70 euros for non-compliance. But I think we're still some months away from that. I wanted to touch on the safety requirements. So in the absence of a harmonized standard, like a nice checklist of tests that we must perform against our on our products, what the regulation asks us to do is asks us to look at our product, look at its essential characteristics, look at how it impacts other products and how other products can impact your product. And where there is where there's vital information that you need to give the customer. So say, for example, you ship a product with its own power adapter, and to use a different power adapter could cause a safety issue with your product. Then that would be vital information that you had to give the customer, because a product that they could use with your product would have a fundamental impact on the safety of your product. It also asks us to look at the presentation of the product. So is the labeling accurate? Are we giving the right information to the consumer? Are we misleading them in some way? Is all of that vital safety information on the product? And then also, what are the different categories of consumers that could come into contact with your product? So, you know, if it's not fit for children, then you mark it as such so that anybody with the product knows that it shouldn't be in the hands of children or under certain age groups. Is it safe for the elderly? Is it safe for people with disabilities? It really asks you to think about all the different subcategories of consumers that might come into contact with your product, and how do you mitigate against the risk of them using your product, or importantly misusing your product to the point where they put themselves at risk. And then also, is the product's appearance misleading? And this goes back to that kind of like, does it look like a food substance or a food product but actually it's not? Or similarly, does it look like a toy but it's not? And then in terms of the technical file, and so imagine you've taken all of these kind of criteria and you've done your internal risk assessment and you've come up with your kind of like safety instructions for your consumer, or similarly, maybe there aren't any, and if there aren't any, we can't make them up just for the purposes of GPSR, and the regulation allows for the fact that it knows GPSR will touch a lot of low risk products, and where there is no potential risk, then your technical file is going to be very, very small. But when you're pulling together that technical file, if you, in the design or the manufacturing of your product, if you complied with any standards, be they EU standards, international standards, US standards, any kind of standards that you've adhered to in the design and the manufacturing of your product, then they should be in the technical file, because they demonstrate a certain level of due diligence around that design and that manufacturing. Where your product is either CE marked or you have adhered to these safety requirements, then we've got what's called a presumption of conformity with the GPSR. Hope that's clear. I want to break it down to different players in the supply chain now. So I think I mentioned manufacturers, importers, distributors, authorized reps, and then online marketplaces. And they all have kind of like a unique role to play, and they have different but similar obligations on them depending on where they sit within that distribution chain. So in terms of the manufacturer, where you are, where you've rebranded the goods, so say, let's use one example, you've had the goods manufactured elsewhere for you. You are responsible for making sure that if those goods carry your brand, that they've been manufactured according to your explicit instructions or your designs, or similarly that you've been given assurances by your supplier that they adhere to certain standards. So that's your responsibility. You must kind of like adhere to those safety requirements that we talked about. You must conduct your own internal risk assessment and pull together your technical file and all of the labeling information and everything. I don't think you can ever be too detailed in a technical file. The more you can pull together, the more due diligence that you can show you have taken, then it kind of indemnifies you. If a consumer uses your product incorrectly, even though you've explicitly instructed them that there's risks of doing so, what more can you do? So I think technical files are detailed for that very reason. They must carry, the product must carry your details. So it must be your name, your postal address, and your it says electronic address. You can interpret that as email or website details, but it must the consumer must be able to contact you directly as the manufacturer to log any product safety issues that they might have encountered. You're responsible for making sure that that safety information is in the correct language, and you're responsible for appointing that EU responsible person, whether it be your EU importer, distributor, or whether you've appointed an independent authorised representative. And there must be a formal agreement between you and them that sets out clearly what their obligations are and what your obligations are. In the event, you're basically committing to, in the event of a product safety issue, that you'll bring that product into conformity, without delay. So that means either recalling it from the market, withdrawing it from the market, having the customer dispose of it, or so on. And you're responsible for making sure that that knowledge gets out there far and wide. there's been a few issues in the news recently. I don't know whether I'm just so tuned into GPSR at the minute, but there was something else flashed up on my phone at 5 o'clock this morning again about something else. So you can see technically how it works. I think it was candles. That's it. There was Christmas candles that have been withdrawn from the market because they're a fire hazard. But essentially, where there's a risk identified, then it's kind of, there's notifications firing off everywhere, and you as the manufacturer are responsible for informing your consumers, either directly where you've got their contact information, or by selecting a platform that has the widest possible reach. In this case, it was on BBC News, for example, and I think it might have been Sky as well. So you're responsible for getting that word out there, and similarly using those players in your distribution chain to make sure that they're getting the word out to their counterparts, and then registering the product safety issue on the business gateway. I think that's it. Oh, apart from, where there have been product safety issues, obviously where they've been investigated and remedied, you must keep official records of that activity for, I think it's 5 years. I can clarify for you. The technical file, sometimes where some of us haven't had to pull a technical file together before, it helps to know kind of like the component parts that are within that. So I've just listed those there. I will give the guys a copy of these slides, so you're welcome to go through these at your leisure. I don't want to focus too much time on here. Then we move on to importer. I can probably list what the importer's obligations are. So assume this is the EU importer. Essentially, they have many of the same responsibilities as the manufacturer, but kind of different in so much as, because they're further down the distribution chain, they technically can't place a product on the EU marketplace unless they've made sure that the manufacturer is compliant. So, it's things like making sure that the product is labeled correctly with all of the relevant safety regulation and so on. And importantly, where they have transported the product or been responsible for storing it, they must make sure that nothing they've done to the product while it's been in their care has had the potential to impact that product's safety. But fundamentally, the kind of role is very similar. It's all about safeguarding the safety of those consumers by making sure the product's correctly labelled, that it's transported and stored correctly, and that the manufacturer has been fully compliant in terms of the risk assessments and making sure that the product is safe for the market. And then I often think distributors and importers can be one and the same. And an EU importer can be distributing the product as well. And, so whilst the regulation splits it out, again, responsibilities are the same. They can't place the product on the market unless it is fully compliant with GPSR. So their role is to hold the original manufacturer to account to make sure that they have been fully compliant, which is why the regulations described as being for B2C, and we often hear, well, B2B sales are exempt, and they kind of are to a certain extent because you're not selling direct to the consumer. But if you've got one of your distribution partners further down the line is in turn going to have to place compliant product on the marketplace, then they're going to come back to you as the manufacturer for information. So there is still a level of compliance, even though I don't think it's particularly clear from the regulation. So as a manufacturer, even if you're selling B2B, I would say you need to start focusing on your technical files. You need to start making sure that the product is labeled correctly with your details, and take care to make available those safety instructions. It might be your distributor who is responsible for translating them to get them onto the market where they're selling, and it might be that they're over labeling the product with their importer or distributor details. So they have a part to play in a B2B engagement. But if you look at the regulation that's coming down the line from the EU and globally, there's so much more focus on transparency of supply chains and making sure that you can trace product back to source. So GPSR is actually complying with GPSR is getting you in a good position to start complying with other stuff that's coming down the line. Your authorised representative, so this is, I looked upon this as being an independent representative. So that's a company that might be representing lots of different brands. They will have an established entity in the EU, and they're responsible for maintaining your technical file, and effectively they're the conduit between you and the market surveillance authorities, because the market surveillance authorities don't want to deal with companies outside of the EU. They want to deal with companies inside of the EU. And I caveat this with, you know, the EU knows that broadly speaking, our products are very compliant with EU regulation. You know, we can't place unsafe product on our domestic market. But they, as I see it, as many of us experts see it, they are trying to stem the flow of unsafe, unsustainable, poor quality product from further afield that has started to flood the EU market over recent years, and poses risks to consumers and the environment. And I think when you think about governments, they've got two options, broadly speaking, two options to stem the flow of these goods. They can impose additional duties. They can impose anti-dumping duties on product coming from further afield or coming from specific suppliers in certain countries. But then that supplier will just pop up under another brand, and then they have to go through that whole thing again. So this broad brush kind of regulation is a more belts and braces approach to it. And I think what's going to happen longer term, not immediately, but we will see a situation whereby some brands or some products and companies will have to withdraw from the market because they just can't meet the kind of stringent environmental, sustainability, safety regulations that the EU is starting to really impose quite stringently. So you could argue that for, you know, products from markets that do take these kind of standards very seriously also, that could potentially open up more opportunity for them longer term. I've just put very quickly in, for those of you appointing an authorised representative, the kind of things that you would look out for in a mandate that they send to you, what it should kind of have. Or similarly, if you are looking to appoint your distributor in the EU or your importer in the EU, this gives a flavour of how you could kind of pull together your own mandate. Global Trade Department does offer that service now. We kind of had our hand forced a little bit with GPSR. We had a number of our micro businesses and lower tier SMEs that just, they couldn't afford the thousands of pounds that were being quoted by other authorised representatives. So we've had to kind of set ourselves up in that role so that they can continue trading with Northern Ireland and the EU. Online marketplaces, your eBays, your Amazons, your Etsy's and so on, they have a different role to play. They are the ones that are responsible for removing sellers from their platform if they're not seen to be GPSR compliant. And they have a role to play in terms of liaising with the authorities in the case of any kind of product safety issue. So they have a very specific role. And those of you that might be selling via Amazon or eBay, Etsy's been a bit slow on the uptake, but Amazon and eBay, and some of the other kind of sector specific platforms, you might have already had some notification from them or certain kind of emails saying, have you got this in place? Have you got that in place? And it's probably all to do with GPSR. They're trying to get their ducks in a row. And then I mentioned economic operators earlier. That's that catch-all phrase for any kind of individual that isn't caught up or isn't pigeonholed as a distributor, an importer, a manufacturer, so on. Just very quickly, the Consumer Safety Network, I refer to these as the boffins that make all this regulation. They're compiled of specialists from across the EU, and they're responsible for pulling together this regulation, but importantly, monitoring how it's implemented. So I personally think we will see a set of implementation guidelines related to GPSR as it starts to bed in, because it is quite unwieldy in its current format, and it is quite unclear as to, we've got our set of products that are exempt, but actually when you dig deeper and you get into subsectors, you realize that actually there are more exemptions. It's just very nebulous as a set of regulation, and I think probably purposefully because it's so vast in terms of its coverage. But anyway, these are the guys that we need to blame for it. And as I always say in these sessions, if you're as sad as me, you can go in and you can read the minutes of their meetings that I held 2-3 times a year. we do it because it gives you an insight as to what's coming down the line, but it's not the best bedtime reading, so I wouldn't advise it. I've just given you a couple of links to the SafetyGate portal here. So the link to subscribe to the product safety alerts, and the link to go and create your profile so that you have a profile waiting in the hopefully unlikely event that your product has a product safety issue and you have to go and report it. Why would you subscribe to product updates or safety updates? Essentially, what I suppose, with goods that have various different component parts and you've manufactured the finished goods, there might be a component that is in your product that has proven to be faulty or dangerous when it's been incorporated into somebody else's product, another brand's product, for example, say. So you might want to be alerted if that product suffers a product safety issue, so that you can then withdraw your product from the market, or at least start to do some internal testing to ensure that the batches that you got weren't actually impacted in the same way. So it's all, you can see how it's all kind of like connected. Market surveillance and compliance, just to touch briefly on this. So initially, and I think this is why the Brits particularly have found themselves in a bit of a tizzy about GPSR, it's because initially we see very much customs as being the ones that will police the compliance with this regulation. You know, they're the ones, they're typically the eyes and ears of market surveillance authorities. They do documentary checks on goods to clear them, but sometimes they'll pull goods and they'll inspect them, physical inspections. So they're really the only mechanism for policing this regulation in the immediate term. And of course, now that Great Britain's outside of the EU, we've got to get past customs to get our product on the marketplace in the first place. So we've had that hurdle to jump over. Where you're a company established in Northern Ireland or in mainland Europe or Southern Ireland, you don't have that. You've got that notion of kind of still free circulation of goods. Oh, I remember those happy days. So your products are already on the market. And I have to be honest, I don't know how they're going to police this, you know, for products that are already on the market, other than to say, I think it'll be a case of when there's a product safety issue, that's when it will come to light that there's issues of non-conformance, you know, where there's no authorized representative in place, or there's no technical file for the product. I think that's when it'll come to light. But it's difficult to see with such far-reaching regulation how it's going to be policed longer term in the market. Finally, I have put together these are the details of the different market surveillance authorities across the EU that are responsible for product safety. So in the event that you have a product and you're really not sure, you know, whether you're within scope, or if you're in, or if you're within scope and you want to check on your labeling or your safety information or anything like that, these guys are obligated as per the regulation to help third-party countries comply with GPSR. So I would say from experience, some of the Western member states have been quicker to respond, but I think that's been a language thing. And we always translate our requests. And I think sometimes if you can do that for some of the Eastern European states, then sometimes you get quicker replies where maybe English isn't quite as widely adopted. And then finally, the penalties for non-compliance. I don't want to be alarmist here. I don't want to be, it was just so many people have asked us, well, you know, if we don't comply, what are we facing? And you go out to the market surveillance authorities and they come back with like worst case scenario. Oh, we can up to 25,000 euros, up to 200,000 euros. Again, like I said earlier, this is very much where you have deliberately been fraudulent, or negligent and misled the market. This isn't simply for, you know, not putting your authorized representative details on your product, for example. So just, you know, it's not meant to be alarmist. And then finally, all I wanted to say was, as I said at the beginning, we cannot, I mean, we're a small company ourselves, and I think we're surviving on about 2 hours sleep at the moment because we've been deluged with companies that desperately need support in this area because it's hit them so last minute. And I think ourselves and DBT and Business Wales and other players in that kind of like business support area realize that we have to get better at this. We have to get better at giving our small businesses more foresight of what's coming down the line, more time to plan, more support to get compliant, So I suppose in the absence of anybody kind of taking the lead on this, we're saying, okay, we're regulatory experts. We've got this regulation mapped out till 2032 and beyond. If we have to be the ones that are pushing this stuff out to small businesses, even if they say, actually, when that doesn't concern us, we don't need to worry about it, or yes, I need to take a closer look at that, then that is what we're going to do. So if you want to opt into that kind of community that we're building, just so that you can be in receipt of this kind of information, then just opt in at contact@globaltradedebt.com. And then I think that's it. And I know I've gone way over my time. I'm so sorry, but I'll take questions.
Thanks a lot, Andrea. I'm going to quickly ask some questions that I hopefully will cover things for a lot of people, because I know I asked them with you. So I'm sure lots of people are going, oh my God, I've got a warehouse full of stock. What on earth? Do I have to put stickers on them? And we covered this, didn't we, with a statement? Yeah. And I'm going to paste the statement into the chat.
And that has been working, Chris. We've got product even getting into Germany where that's been put on the commercial invoice. So that's all good.
So I've just posted in the statement. These goods are existing stock of product lines already on the market and fully conform. I'm not going to read the whole thing out, but that can go with your customs paperwork.
Yes.
For anything. So that's anything that you have in a warehouse somewhere in the world and it's on its way. But obviously anything that is about to print, about to produce in China, a boxed board game perhaps, you should be working out what you need to put on the packaging.
It buys us that little bit of time, really, which I think is important.
Yeah. Stephen Baker asked about crowdfunding. You know, if you're funding a product, and I think we resolved it, but effectively, as soon as that product is being made and shipped across the border to a distributor or a fulfillment company and then out to customers, that is just as much as if you sold it on the website.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
I know a lot of people are going to go, but surely we can put a QR code on the product. That will do it.
I think so. I can't remember whether we covered this, Chris, but honestly, I have been backwards and forwards to the market surveillance authorities, and you absolutely can, but it doesn't replace the physical safety information that has to accompany the goods, either on the product, on its packaging, or on the documentation that accompanies the product. They won't move away from that. Whether that is developed in future, we'll see, because I know they're making a move towards it for manuals for CE marked goods. You'll be able to use QR codes for those moving forward. But at the moment, no, it doesn't. It's supplementary to the safety data that goes with the product.
So it might be advisable for people to put a QR code on their product anyway for in future case, and that links to a safety page.
Yeah.
People have been asking about, of course, typically in our industry, you're putting a CE product on a game because you want to sell to children, or certainly under 14s, and often there's the but I put not for under 14s on my product, and that I don't need a CE mark. So now that doesn't have any impact on this, because you still need to adhere to the GPSR regulations regardless of whether you're a CE product or not a CE product.
That's correct. Yeah
Okay. Also, I'm sure a few of people are thinking, I've got a mate in Madrid, can they be the person who represents us?
Yes, is fundamentally, in terms of complying with regulation, yes, you can have that individual residing in the EU or a company established in the EU. I think the only thing, I personally wouldn't want to impose those obligations on a friend or family member of mine, because you have to think about indemnity insurance, and this is a long-term engagement. They have an obligation to maintain the technical file 10 years from the point at which that product was delisted from the market, if you like. So it's a long-term commitment, but it is compliant potentially.
Let's talk quickly about the big products in this room are people publishing books, boxes of toy soldiers, resin, metal, plastics, and board games and card games, so which are most often being made in China and being brought in. So there are all sorts of mixed components. We talked about books, which has been a bit confusing, but could you just reiterate on your understanding what needs to be on the back of a book and what needs to be inside a book?
Yeah, so to be honest, it again, it's not prescriptive as to where the information is. I've seen some books that may have like an outer cover, and then on the inside of that outer cover they've got kind of like the publisher details and everything. It can go there, or the information can go on the back of the book, like say if it's just a paperback book. They are, as we understand it, within scope of GPSR, even though they are ridiculously low risk in terms of, you know, the risk they pose to consumers. But they are within scope, so they do require, whilst there may not be any safety information because they're not high risk goods, short of them falling on your head or somebody throwing the book at you, they must include the publisher's details and the authorized representative details. Interestingly, and I can't remember whether it was with you or with somebody else, Chris, but somebody did start to say, what about trigger warnings for books?
Yeah.
And
we talked about, yeah, because some books in our industry have maybe extreme over 18 content, and we'd often, and many of us would put warning mature content. And I think we resolved that if you would put warning mature content in English on the back of the book, that you should probably put that in the 24 languages on the inside of the book.
Yeah, so that's kind of like a situation where I wouldn't normally say that was product safety, but it's obviously a hotter topic, which does have a bearing on how the consumer can be impacted by the product. So I think it warrants being on there.
So just to recap on books, having the EU reps details on the back of the book, and then as usual the company's name, the printer's name on the inside of the book. And we also talked about the batch numbers, and normally in the book trade people put a random number. We're going to use our purchase order number with the batch number at the end, because often people in the book trade don't like saying this is the second edition or third edition, because customers complain, why didn't I get the first edition? So and that can all be inside the book on your kind of credits page. Absolutely.
And I think where was I going to go with it's just flown out of my head. Carry on, it'll come back to me. I've just completely forgotten about something.
Okay, so let's cover board games. And sorry, yes, so as we asked, do we need to get the safety report for the glue and the ink used in a book? And I think you believe, and of course this is not a legal seminar with official advice, the understanding is that's possibly not needed, because books are inherently safe and people don't tend to try to swallow them
or sit and lick a page. Yes. Absolutely. I think I mean, obviously, where that information exists, if you're able to get a copy of stuff from your suppliers, then why wouldn't you, and hold it in the technical part, which further indemnifies you.
Yeah. So then let's consider board games and card games and boxes of dice, which a lot of us are making over in China or sometimes in Europe, and that's where it should have the EU reps details on the back and any safety. So if your game is designed for children or under 14s, then it should have the CE mark or other information such as the choking hazard. Now and when anytime there's a box, where we talked about having this maybe a piece of paper, it could be in the rule book if it's inside a box, that has all the relevant safety information translated into the 24 languages in small print, as long as it's readable, and that should be that needs to be inside the product.
Yes, so if it's technically that you're compliant because it's with the product, so it's documentation accompanying the product. Now, any of you that are developing information to go with CE marked goods, there is a minimum font and you can't go any lower than that. But for GPSR, you don't have that exact stipulation.
And often we're all doing various safety tests in China for the contents of the game, And now let's come to then that brings us to technical files, because we also had the conversation about, oh my gosh, do I need a technical for every single book I produce, or I've got 300 sets of miniatures? Do I need a separate technical file? And we talked about how GPSR actually does allow you to group similar products, right?
Yeah, if I explain how we group them for our clients, because we want to make sure that they're not overly burdened by maintaining lots of technical files, and we want to make sure that we can give them very palatable pricing for maintaining that technical file for them, or keeping that technical file. So we look to group products into categories according to what they are, so their intended use, what is the product, what the product's composition is, so what it's made of, and what its risk profile is. And where we can get groups of products that share those criteria, we can class them as one product for the purpose of GPSR, and that's perfectly permitted within the regulation to group those products like that. And then obviously that means you've got one product, one technical file, but within that technical file you can reference the different SKUs that you've grouped together, so it's all fully traceable. It's just a lot more manageable.
Yeah, I mean, I think we use the example, we use monday.com, but also, for example, it could be a Google Sheet which has line by line each SKU of your books or your miniature sets, but along the columns you're going to need a link to the safety document, a link to if there's a safety test, but it could be a safety test for the entire batch, your batch of the resin, or the resin that you use, or the safety text from the factory for that particular game. But one thing,
sorry, Chris, is resin subject to kind of REACH regulation in terms of chemicals and so on like that?
In its raw form, once it's actually set, it's different. But yeah, okay. What our determination is that we would, you need the safety test or safety documentation from the factory, and obviously you need to be able to track batches, and someone did ask about batches above, so you do need to be able to know that this box was the second printing of the game, and what we're assuming is everything in stock is the first edition, and anything that is new is obviously a first edition. If you're reprinting a box game, that would be your second edition or your third edition, and you need to know which edition it is, so that if there is a problem, which we all hope there isn't, and the factory says there's a problem with the plastic we used, at least you know where those copies went.
Yeah.
Referred to. I'm going to run through some of the questions here. So let's just see if there's anything we could Annie Norman asked if we could currently ship items with that notice. Where would that notice go? Yes, and that's what we're doing. We're putting the notice in the on the paperwork that ships with the product, both for trade orders and for customer orders. So that would be the customs invoice,
or the packing list. Yeah,
packing lists and so on.
Yeah.
Phil Beldelsky says, my products don't have CE markers, they were not required previously. Do I now need CE mark? That's only if you were intending to sell them to children.
I don't know the nature of his particular products, but the CE mark regulation hasn't changed. So if he hasn't fallen within the scope of that specific regulation previously, then GPSR hasn't impacted that.
Yeah. Matt Gilbert says, if we create a company in Ireland, can we use that address on the packaging as the EU contact?
Yes, you can. That would be an EU entity. Yeah.
Yeah. If we have a website selling products to EU customers, do we have to register on the online marketplace registration portal? No.
So the terminology of online marketplaces is for the standard kind of Amazons and Etsy's and so on. It's not your own website. It's when somebody else hosts a volume of sellers. That's an online marketplace. Yeah.
If a manufacturer makes product X and they have a responsible person to represent that product in the EU, do imported distributors or online retailers need their own responsible person to sell those goods, or they just need the details of the manufacturer's responsible person?
The latter. So where the original manufacturer has appointed their own authorized rep, and your members here are just simply distributing the product, then they can use that. They can reference that authorized rep that the manufacturer has set up. They don't need to appoint their own.
So as manufacturers, we need to be talking to our distributors and going, here is our technical files, here's our rep.
Yeah.
James Barry says, will this apply to Kickstarter rewards sold before this came into effect and are now being fulfilled? Which
I think you might have answered that before.
So I think if they haven't been printed or they haven't been manufactured, then yes, they do. If they've been manufactured and they're on the way to your warehouse, then you would use that text to go with the shipment. And as Andrea said, they've been using it. It doesn't mean that won't change, but it looks like that is going to cover people in the short term. And as you said, a lot of this is still on, the onus is on all of us to comply, and on distributors. And you may start to see your distributors start to request this more, but until they request it, product will probably keep flowing. Then I guess customs will start to apply this when they're pulling products to check.
Well, potentially, but sometimes if you imagine an import declaration or a commercial invoice, where the product is going to a business in the EU, they'll probably have an EU EORI number that identifies them as a business. So they can even see at that level that it's a B2B sale rather than a B2C sale.
Yeah. Brian Tyrrell says, what do we do when manufacturers don't follow any safety standards that they're willing to share? A company, for example, said they don't want to disclose any standards. Another local printer I work with, 3 staff, they don't have safety assessments for certificates because they have 2 machines total.
Yeah, I mean, I think, longer term, this is the kind of robustness that the EU is trying to establish. It's trying to force people's hands to have this kind of documentation or standards internally. It's a tough one. You could, for argument's sake, where you can't get that information, you could take the responsibility of, okay, I'm going to almost assume the role of manufacturer, and I'm going to perform my own risk assessments on it, and I'm going to send it away for testing if potentially that is an option.
But as you said, this is all about, if there's a problem, did you do something about it beforehand, or did you just go, no, it's not going to affect me, I'll be fine? So have you made attempts to keep the records and have a process in place?
Yeah.
James Stacker says, can sticker labeling be placed on shrink wrap of existing product, or on the actual, does it have to be on the actual product itself?
No, that it's fine to overlabel a shrink wrap product. That's fine.
So safety text, things like that.
That's the bizarre thing, right? Because the exact regulation says it must be ideally on the product, or where not possible on the packaging or on the documentation. Now we know that the documentation and the packaging is quite often the first thing that gets discarded. So you question, well, how long is this information going to be in the hands of a consumer? But that, to do that, you're fully compliant. Yeah,
it's all about compliance. And we talked about the extreme case of, I don't know, a jewelry supplier who has a little dangler with a piece of some earrings on it, and they're going to have this big piece of paper, which probably undoes years of EU environmental packaging.
It's crazy.
So
hopefully they'll relent on some of that and realize that QR codes are the way to go, but until that point
we do have to at least be showing that we're
willing.
Let's run through, if anyone just running through the questions. Any guidance on customs labels and codes? I'm hearing a lot of orders being rejected from Northern Ireland customs, even when correctly labelled. I don't know whether that's to do with GPSR. We've got a call with a client next week that's encountering the same, but actually it started before GPSR came into effect. And remember, because Northern Ireland is still technically part of the UK customs regime,
the checks on products going into Northern Ireland are far less than the checks on goods going into Ireland or mainland Europe. So I'm not entirely sure at that point whether this is GPSR or not.
Yeah, I think so. And commodity codes are sometimes one of the easiest things to get wrong. Andrea LaRosa said, is all this information need to be in the local language of the country you're selling to? So I think we looked at this. If let's say you're selling a card game or a board game and you're shipping it to Blackfire, the distributor in Germany, they could be selling it anywhere across Europe. So you do have to assume that the safety language needs to be in all 24 languages. And you did point out, is it, what's the AI translator that you recommended?
DeepL, so Delta Echo Echo Papa Lima.
Which is trained on the European legal language. Which
it is, yes.
Now that's the, as you pointed out, it's not the usage text, it's the actual safety text. So I guess in the example of a board game contains, this is not a toy, not for under 14s, contains small parts, choking hazard. And so if that's the text, that needs to be in the 24 languages. So you could put it into DeepL and get your translation. And that would need to be inside the product. And I guess, is there any guidance on where? Can it be on the back page? Should it be on the front page with all the credits before people read anything?
It's not prescriptive. So it's a little bit, that's the point I wanted to make earlier. We were talking about unique identifiers, barcodes, and all the rest of it, first and second edition books. Again, that unique identifier is not prescriptive. So it can be anything that makes sense to your internal setup, your organization, that allows you to withdraw certain product from the market, to isolate impacted product and withdraw it from the market. So it doesn't have to be a barcode. Some clients that we're working with, produce very low volume of goods, so they'll just use the order number and they'll be able to trace it that way.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Sorry, I'm just catching up on everyone's comments. How would you track additions with someone, for example, a contract caster sending you batches of restock? Is every restock a batch? That could be a lot of batches. Yeah, it's a good example, actually, because we have our own resin factory. And so we're buying in big batches of resin. And I'll give you our example, Andrea. This is perhaps the more complicated one. So they would make the bodies of the toy soldier. And they would make the arms, and we might have a load of arms left over, which might end up in another box. So I guess, we're tracking that particular big delivery of resin as a batch number, which needs to go on somewhere on the product. But what happens when there might be different batches of components, where a factory might store parts 1, 2, and 3, and from multiple batches?
I think again, that's almost like your internal stock control, isn't it? Rather than necessarily GPSR. So what you would look to see in the technical file might be the methodology that you've applied to develop that unique identifier. So you'd know it was batch number plus order number plus SKU or something like that. You wouldn't necessarily look to put that detail in the technical file, but it must make sense to you internally. So if you've got, that's more kind of like, I would say, your stock control system and your ERP system and so on, than anything else.
Which it's the manufacturer's job. I mean, I think for Annie, each batch for you is every shipment from your caster, because and what their parts are made up is they have to track that themselves. But for you, getting a delivery of miniatures that you've had cast would be your latest batch. Gavin, you had a hand up.
Yeah, no, you just answered it. I was going to say that Annie's question was about Annie doesn't manufacture the goods herself. She buys them in. So does she still count? Sorry, Annie, I'm talking about you in the third person. Does she still count as the manufacturer in that instance?
Yeah. Briallen says, can we take products over to a convention and sell them? And this doesn't include already printed books. I'm guessing, well, I guess you have to make sure that the products you're taking, whether it's yours or someone else's, have got the right information on them, as if you're a seller then at the convention.
Yeah, it's quite possible. You know, we've got some clients that are occupying more than one role, so they'll manufacture their own goods, which are the manufacturer, but then they will be distributing other goods from another manufacturer. They'll have their own branded goods and other goods. So you've really got to identify what role you play in terms of GPSR, and where you're not directly responsible, you need to push up chain or down chain.
Fee Baldowski asks, what's the deadline to get representation?
It was technically the 13th of December, but but we've got this kind of, you know, this working through existing stock. How long we can drag that out for is questionable.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say, you know, short of saying imminently, don't let it drag on too long, because customers will start clocking that, you know.
Yeah. So and people like Andrea and her company can provide that service for you, or you can find someone, maybe a distributor you have in Europe is happy to handle that for you. Like I said, it's all about, are you making efforts to get it sorted? If you're currently shipping stock that is going to use that disclaimer because it's already made, then that will cover you in the short term. But you know, the main thing is to be working on it and getting someone in place. But yeah, officially it was December 13th, but I don't think anyone was ready. Cassandra, does safety language need to be on a separate document with the game box, or can it be printed on the back of a rulebook? We actually did cover that, so it could be anywhere in the rulebook. Saves having to make another booklet. The information on the batch number for the components needs to be on the inside the box as well. Yes, well, it's up to you. It could be on the box, but obviously most of us often print lots of boxes and then slowly fill them. So you might want to put a sticker on the outside of the box. Maybe it's a barcode sticker that sometimes people use, has the batch number on, or when you print your little safety text, you could put a batch number on there and print them in batches. I think, oh, at the end of the questions, has anyone got any other questions that we haven't covered? I'm just having a quick scan through. Gavin, go on.
Yeah, so just one question we've had come up today. If we are doing replacement parts, say for instance, we have a board game and we need to ship out a new rule book to somebody, and that rule book is a zero cost replacement because it's faulty, or it was missing from the original order or something like that, does that individual component need to contain all the same information as it would do were it an entire product?
I suppose, go on, Andrea.
No, you take this one and I'll feed
Let me
in.
see if I can answer a bit. So if it's a book, I guess you should treat the rule books as a book in their own right. So they should have whatever you would put on a book. So it would be the safety text related to the book. But if a rule book is also covering the components of a box, it would also have that. So it more than covers what you need. If you're sending out playing cards or replacement figurines or dice from a board game, that's when it like individual little components, Andrea, I guess that's where it's complicated.
Yeah, I would say so.
And that, I suppose then you're going to need some kind of, maybe just a piece of paper with this, it would be cheaper to have any general safety text related to the types of products you send out that you can just put in an envelope when you send a replacement part. Does that sound right?
It sounds a way forward without being an expert in your sector. I think that's the challenge. We're still uncovering things, and we're still kind of like thinking about how it's going to work. It's still incredibly early days despite all the panic. But I mean, because obviously we're connected, Chris, so as we start to learn more, we'll be pushing it down to you so you can disseminate it to your guys. So we'll keep you informed of developments as it beds in, if you like.
Yeah, I suppose just very quick, because us big companies can pay to get the help, but the little guys amongst us are probably going, oh my gosh, this is such a nightmare, what do I need to do? And I think, just in summary, if I could put this together, so obviously you need to look at the safety text that is on the back of the product that you have there right now, translate it using DeepL or with your friends, up to you, into the various languages, and make sure that's inside the product the next time you print it and produce it. And you need to put together your technical files, which, again, if you have lots of products that are the same, sets of metal miniatures or sets of dice or nice, beautiful rolled up fabric containers, Fee does, then you could use a like a Google Sheet. And again, make sure you've got one thing we remembered, we have to have a picture of the back of the product that shows the safety information on the back of the product alongside that file, along with a link to whatever it is you print off as your safety sheet or page of safety information. So we will be sending this video out to anyone who's on the mailing list. If you weren't on the mailing list, send an email to support@mediafist.com. I'll be posting a link to the video out.
And I'll send through the slides as well, Chris. And if I can just like finish off by saying, you know, if you need to reach out, if you're unsure about anything, then by all means get in touch before you make the decision not to proceed to comply, because it might be a lot easier just a 5-10 minute call with ourselves. It might be easier than you think to actually press ahead. We've worked so hard with micro businesses and small tier SMEs over the last 6 years with Brexit, and they're still plugging away at it and still, you know, trying their best to re-establish their position in the EU. Don't let GPSR be the thing that makes you switch off to it. It's a great market for us, and if it's just a case of picking up the phone and speaking to one of us here to get a little bit of clarity on something, then we're more than happy to do that.
I think one of the big takeaways is, if you're currently not shipping to Europe because you're afraid of being caught out, then use that disclaimer and keep shipping to Europe for the moment. Don't panic, but just have a process in place to start working on this.
Yeah.
Brian and I would love to see an example of a file. I don't think anyone's done it. Have you?
So what I can send through that might be helpful, just to get you thinking about the kind of information you need to collate. We've got a technical file framework that I can send through with the slides, and it's what our platform has been based on. So it kind of gets you thinking about the various different supporting documentation or stuff that you need to be including in a technical file. It might be useful to take a look at that.
So for things like books, it should be very simple. You know, for a board game, there's the usual safety tests that you would do for a board game that, you know, just means attaching those files. If you use a platform like monday.com where you've got all the products listed there, that's quite a good way to store it. Fee, how long will it take to set up representation? Do you mean with Andrea or with whoever you work with? I mean, if often you've got people offering the service.
Well, obviously Andrea seems very knowledgeable about this whole situation, so I probably would want to talk to it, because, you know, my product, we have a lot of different products, not just a board game. We sell lots of different products. It would be a bit of a nightmare, I think, if I was to go with someone who's a bit less experienced.
Sure.
So what I can do, Fee, if it would be helpful, is I can send Chris a link that allows you to book a call directly with myself, so we can have a conversation, because you might think I've got a lot of products, but actually when we start, I don't know your product portfolio obviously, and we can explore it, but you might find that the way that we condense products down, you might find that for the purposes of GPSR you've got fewer products to maintain a technical file on. We can explore that.
We're going to do it. Hopefully Gamma are going to work with us to do a seminar at some point during the Gamma show, and we'll probably show this seminar and or do a sort of concise version of it for tabletop companies. And as Andrea feeds any more advice and guidance to us, we'll pass it out to everyone on the mailing list. Hopefully they do, Sean. Great. Thank you so much, Andrea. We've gone way over your time, and I know it's your evening, and I mean you must be exhausted from everyone.
It's not a problem. If we can just, you know, keep shipping to the EU, then I'm happy. I'm happy. So I think what's been wonderful about this regulation, the only wonderful part of it, is the fact that I've just discovered these subsectors of amazing companies that we have in the UK that I've and you know, further afield that I never get the opportunity to interact with normally. So it's been fantastic from that perspective. So thank you for pitching up and listening to me this evening.
Great, and thanks everyone for joining us. It's nice to see lots of familiar faces, and hopefully see you all at the Gamma show or one of the conventions coming up.
Amazing. All right, take care, everyone.
Cheers.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Right. All right. See you, folks.